I've started to see a lot of headlines that use the word collapse. Like, the Chinese economy is about to collapse. Or, is the crypto space in collapse? Or, is societal collapse imminent? And this word, I think, is a very, very clickbaity type of word. I think the headliners have figured out that people react to that word because it evokes fear. So I wanted to figure out, what should my reaction be, given that I'm an economist and I do think about things that involve collapse. Collapse is possible, like the 2008 financial crisis. In a lot of ways, that was a collapse. There's all kinds of collapses. So how should I react when I see one of these headlines that uses the word collapse? And when it comes to clickbait, on one hand, I think it is important to mostly dismiss words that are incendiary. Like, so many words are just trying to evoke a fear reaction, and that is not helpful at all. And as a matter of fact, if we give in too much to those emotions that these headlines are trying to evoke, I'm not going to be effective as a thinker, because emotional stuff reduces my ability to think critically. So I do want to mostly dismiss words like that. On the other hand, one of my pet peeves is the fact that people are dismissing each other's arguments way too quickly. And I think this is somewhat necessary because we encounter so much incoming information that's packaged to be threatening, that's packaged to get the click, and nobody can really cognitively survive in that environment without a bunch of ways of just dismissing things quickly as that's not a real issue because fill in the blank. And the problem here is that people aren't listening to one another. Everybody has their set of issues that they take seriously, that they think carefully about. And all of the other incendiary headlines and everything, we have ways of dismissing those. So if we get into a conversation with someone who's in a different space and they're worried about different things, our reaction to their real arguments might be just very dismissive in a way that is not logically sound. It's just you've developed this cognitive armor to dismiss that for reasons that aren't valid. They just help you emotionally survive in this information overload environment. So I don't want to do that. I need a way of figuring out, when is the word collapse actually on to something real? And when is that word just sort of inserted somewhere where it doesn't belong just to get the click? So the first question I might ask in this journey to figure this out is, what exactly is collapse? How is that defined? And I think it helps me at least to come up with a few images to compare to figure out, is this real collapse? And the first image in my head is the house of cards, of course. Then I might think of the 2008 financial collapse, which I think had real features of collapse. A pyramid industry or a pyramid scheme is another thing that can collapse eventually. When people say civilizational collapse, they'll talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire, which might have been over thousands of years. So I put a mental asterisk in my head that collapse, the time over which collapse happens, might depend on the situation. A company going bankrupt could potentially be considered collapse, depending on how it goes down. All right, the next step is to get into a more valid way of defining this. And I would like to turn to systems thinking to do this, where systems thinking involves looking at stock and flow and feedback loops. So if we're thinking about the house of cards, the stock is going to be the stock of cards that are in that vertical structure. And the collapse, of course, means that stock suddenly disappears. The cards just all collapse on the table. They're no longer held up by the system. So that's that example. With the 2008 financial crisis, I think the type of stock that kind of ran out was people's trust in certain financial markets. And trust is something that I've started thinking of as stock, because our system depends on people trusting the institutions they're interacting with, trusting that they will get their money back, that their money isn't being swindled in some way. So I think trust getting evaporated in a single moment, that's something that can cause collapse, because trust does sometimes easily disappear. What is the stock in a pyramid scheme? Well, the stock is the money, and the flow is the flow of money between these different people who are passing their money up the chain on the pyramid. And of course, it collapses. Everybody loses their stock of money except for those at the very, very top. So I think that's a helpful way of thinking about collapse, is in this stock and flow framework. And in all of those cases, the thing that disappeared was some type of stock that was foundational to making that system work. And I think one thing with the pyramid scheme is that one thing that was foundational to the pyramid scheme is the idea of growth. You have to constantly make the pyramid bigger and bigger and bigger. And when it stops getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it collapses all of a sudden and everybody there loses their money. And I think this assumption of growth is something a lot of people are starting to worry about right now, that there are parts of our own system that depend on that growth obligation. And if the economy cannot grow forever for whatever reason, which is a whole debatable thing, should we worry about some kind of collapse there? Now, when I looked at these examples, one question that came to my mind is a bubble popping, like a financial bubble, is that the same as collapse? And when I thought that through, there wasn't a clear-cut answer. Because in a lot of ways, the bubble is based on a faulty assumption, which is the assumption that, for example, in the housing market collapse that preceded the 2008 financial crisis, people kind of recognized that the housing market was overvaluing houses. And that's the characteristic of a bubble, is that everybody who's participating in the market is overvaluing some asset. Eventually, they have to figure this out. When they figure that out, the bubble pops and a lot of people lose money. So if the stock is money, that bubble popping is kind of like a collapse. It's just a lot of times the people participating in a bubble kind of know that it's going to pop. They're just trying to time it right. They're kind of engaging in gambling on some level. So is a bubble popping a collapse? There's not a clear-cut answer. Now, one other insight I get when I look at these examples is that a collapse doesn't have to be a terrifying thing. Like even the 2008 financial crisis, which was, I think, a real collapse of certain types of markets, it isn't forever. It doesn't mean the system cannot recover from the collapse. It just means perhaps a lot of people are going to lose a lot, and we're going to have to work a little bit to build the system back up with the trust it needs to function the way it did before. And so I think the word collapse should not be as terrifying as sometimes it feels when we're reading these headlines. So if I return to my original question, do I need to worry when I see the word collapse in a headline? I think there's a few more nuanced answers to that. And the first is that collapse thing, is that in my realm of things that I actually think about? And I mean, as an economist and as someone who likes to think about systems, a lot of times when we're talking about collapse, that is in my wheelhouse. But if we're talking about something that's not something I think about, like will the sports industry collapse or something, maybe that's not in my wheelhouse. Maybe me worrying about that is just sucking up emotional energy I don't need to spend on something irrelevant. There's also the issue of the scale of the collapse. Like if I'm considering that businesses could collapse, do I need to feel fear and be emotional if a particular business is about to collapse? And I think the answer is no way. That happens all the time. It's more that I can think of different realms of influence. If that business collapses, does that mean a whole industry is going to collapse? Does it mean industries like banking that the whole world depends upon are going to collapse? Does it mean that the whole economy is about to collapse? And sort of figuring out that headline, what scale of collapse is it even referring to? Or could it even be referring to? And then I think at the end of the day, what I realized in thinking this through is that I would actually like a more robust way of thinking about systems and how they collapse. So I started reading books like Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, and other books in that realm. And I would like to come up with a way of visualizing systems and feedback loops and all of that stuff that goes together. So my hope here really is to put out a few more videos that are thinking about how might I map out and visualize different systems? Because if I had this map in my head about how systems work, I think I'm going to be way better able to answer the question, when should I worry about the word collapse when I read about it in a headline?